Here's my latest report from the Isle of Man, where we have an extraordinary tournament taking place, the FIDE Grand Swiss Tournament. 154 players competing for a prize fund of $433,000 and a qualification spot for the Candidates Tournament. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting us on patreon.com or PayPal. So I thought it was about time we caught up with the world champion. In the first round he did not have an easy time, but he managed to win his game. In the second round he faced a young Russian player, Alexei Sarana, only 19 years old and already rated 2655. We talk a lot about the young talent coming out of India, for example, and China, but in fact Russia is still producing legions of incredibly strong young players and very cultured players as well, and that's what we have here with Alexei Sarana. So not an easy one for Magnus Carlsen. Sarana opened with pawn to e4, and interesting that Carlsen stuck with the Sicilian, of course the variation, the opening that he's had enormous success with over the past year since employing it in the World Championship match last November. And Sarana decides not to play bishop b5, which a lot of Magnus's opponents have been doing recently, but to take him on in the main line in this open Sicilian, in the Sveshnikov variation. So that shows a lot of confidence. And now here, knight d5 is the move that many of Carlsen's opponents have played, including Fabiano Caruana last November, and Carlsen has had enormous success with this as black. He clearly enjoys those positions. But Sarana played bishop g5, and here, well, we've seen, for example, Anish Giri play knight d5 against Carlsen, which is more positional. Carlsen certainly didn't experience any difficulties there. But Sarana has played the old main line of the so-called Sveshnikov variation, where white shatters the kingside pawns. And frankly, I think it's a real surprise that no one has yet, until this game, tried this against Carlsen. So it leads to absolutely wild positions. In the past, f5 was the main move. I used to play this with black in my wild teenage years, and it just leads to crazy positions. I mean, white can play bishop d3. You can also play with, after f5, bishop takes b5 is actually a very dangerous sacrifice. But the modern way of playing is bishop g7, which really, I guess, came into practice maybe 15 years ago, something like that. And this is actually much calmer. Black is delaying playing f5. It's such a rich position, this. And now black immediately counters with knight e7. Now, incidentally, just coming back to this position, there are a couple of players who wanted to challenge this knight on d5 straight away. Well, from a positional point of view, very laudable. However, there is a drawback. Knight f6 is checkmate, so that's why we play bishop g7 first, and only then knight e7 to challenge the knight on d5. Now, if this knight on a3 were centralized, if we put this on e3, then white would have a very pleasant position. But black can get away with this approach because it takes such a long time for white's knight to actually reach a sensible position. And in the meantime, black is fighting hard for the key squares on f5 and d5, and if black manages to break open the position, then he'll have two wonderful bishops, a central pawn majority, and, well, excellent chances. Castles is possible here, that's one of the main moves, and c4 is one of the main moves played by Sarana. And this has been seen literally hundreds of times before. So instead of taking on c4, which would allow that knight back into the game quickly, instead black challenges the centre. That's very logical, leaving that knight a little bit stranded on a3. Both sides castled, and queen h5. Now, Carlsen has actually had this position on 3 previous occasions, twice against Shirov, once against Topalov, and he played rook b8 there, which led to some crazy complications. But very quickly in this game he played d5, which is a beautiful position, actually, quite a slightly comical position with these pawns facing each other. It's like no one wants to capture. This is the approved move, I should say. But you know, both players still playing instantly because this is known theory. So what's the point of playing d5? Well, first things first, this pawn is threatened, so might need to do something about that. If e takes, then this would be a classic Sveshnikov position with this pawn thrusting through the middle, opening up this diagonal, and that's obviously good for black. So c takes d5. And here, well, basically black needs to be able to take the pawn on e4 and follow up with f5. But that's impossible. Let's just check that. So pawn takes pawn, f5 looks great for black, but no, there's a tactic. d6, and then the rook goes in the corner. So this looks really bizarre, but in this position Carlsen played queen d8. Looks very odd to put the queen back on its starting square. It's the best move. This is the computer approved move, and not only that, it's actually been played on 3 previous occasions. So both players playing instantly, they knew their stuff. So if, for example, let's see what happens if white just makes a normal move, rook to the middle. Well, in that case black gets in his desired strategic objective. The pawn duo are very strong, and then queen d6, let's blockade the d pawn, and black has excellent compensation for the pawn. You can see that that knight is still the problem for white. If that were, you know, somewhere central, then, you know, this could be tricky for black, but actually black has very good play here. So let's go back. Queen d8, just played. So e takes f5, and now there's a threat to play f6 with an attack on h7 supported by the bishop. So queen takes, and this has been seen before. Gave a game by Carlsen's compatriot Ariane Tari. Tari played queen e2 here, but actually his opponent got pretty decent play by giving up this pawn and opening up lines. Rook d1 played almost instantly by Sarana, so this is move 18 and both players still in their preparation, but rook d1 is a new move and it looks pretty sensible. So e4, so I mean obviously f6 is a threat now, now that the bishop is protected by the rook, so e4 stops that. And this is pretty much a forced sequence. Bishop takes with a discovered attack on the queen. Queen takes the pawn, and queens are exchanged. So we've reached an endgame where white is a pawn up, but the pawn on b2 is on prise, as well as the bishop on b5. Now, if black can somehow get away with keeping the two bishops, then he could have decent winning chances. But Sarana, still playing instantly, played bishop d7. Remember, white is still a pawn up, so I mean, ideally I would love to be able to play bishop g6, but at this point the knight would be able to enter the game, protecting the pawn on b2, and it has a solid support coming, and that's a very clear and clean pawn up for white. So after bishop d7, Carlsen had to exchange. He did that instantly, and he took on b2, attacking the knight, which came into the middle. And this was the first moment when either player really stopped to think. So we've had 23 moves, played pretty much a tempo, very, very quickly from both players. And Sarana said after the game, yes, of course, this was his preparation. And I would say that Magnus is also following his preparation as well. I mean, perhaps he didn't expect this exact line, but you know, this would be part of his World Championship preparation from last year, no doubt about it. So what are the issues here? Well, it's level material, knight against bishop. This rook is pretty active. This knight is slightly floating around. It would love to land on a square like f5. So white is just a little bit more active. If black could exchange all the rooks and bring the king into the middle and support that pawn, well, that would be a dream. Then, well, black could even be better. But with the active rook, then white has some initiative here. g3, that looks like a very careful move, but it's a good move, because now this rook can enter the game without fearing any back rank difficulties. Carlsen played, I think, the most sensible, most pragmatic move, exchanging off the rook on d7. I mean, we would like to play f5, but that's a pretty fraught move, actually, to expose the 7th rank in this way. Rook d8 is far more sound, far more sensible. So rooks exchanged. That's of benefit to black, and Carlsen activates the other rook. So the knight goes in, and now if black defends passively well, you can see 2 pawns are on freeze, actually. So it's just not possible to do that. So the rook activates and creates counterplay, so that, well, there's now a threat to play e3. Therefore knight takes and rook takes. So further simplification, rook and 3, rook knight and 3 against rook bishop and 3. But white is a little better here. White has chances because you can see that black's king is just a little bit weakened because of that lack of a g-pawn. The a pawn on a6 is going nowhere for the time being. White's king very safe on g2. Of course, white can force a draw here just by coming back to f6. But Sarana wanted to play on, and he can do so without any risk at all. And this position is rather unpleasant for black, actually. You know, you could see, well, Carlsen didn't look too upset. They've played over 30 moves. Both players had loads of time, so Carlsen had time to, you know, reflect on this position to try and find the best defense. But I would hate to defend this position as black. He just seemed to be pretty comfortable with it, but, well, already there are a few tricky decisions. I mean, white basically wants to advance the pawn to g5, as we'll see, and the knight goes into f6, and then the h-pawn advances as well. The squeeze is on. So one idea here would be to play h6 just to stop the pawn advancing for the moment, give the king some room, but then the knight would switch round to f5, and now there's a threat to take on h6. So do you go for that and try and find some way out, or well, Carlsen, after over a 10-minute think, decided to punt the rook's pawn. But this is a really frightening position. So let me give an example. What happens if black continues pushing that pawn? Well, very simple plan of advancing the h-pawn. And after this, well, we take the bishop. Simple as that. So Carlsen had planned a defense, rook b2. And, well, I mean, I was going to kind of throw this over to you actually and say, well, how would you try and draw this? So rook b2 is not an obvious defense. But let's see what happens. h5, again with this threat of h6. Rook b5. This is an excellent idea. I mean, this is actually a study-like defense that Carlsen finds. So what happens on h6 check? Let's have a quick look at this. So you can see that if rook takes bishop, then the rook takes the pawn with check, and then the knight can be taken. So f4, knight h7 would still be a draw. f4 is a dubious move. Bishop here. Now black is getting out. And in fact, black's a-pawn offers very strong counterplay. I mean, basically white is struggling to hold this. Let me just, quick example. Knight f6, pawn goes down, and when the rook prevents the pawn from queening, well, we check and check again and block here. And basically, well, both sides are going to queen, but it'll be black's turn to check first and white's king will suffer. So rook b5, brilliant defense. So instead of playing h6 check, f4, just keeping options open. And, well, now black has to play again precisely. Carlsen found h6. So if pawn takes, and then black is just in time. You can see that rook performs beautifully across the 5th rank there. After h6, Sarana played knight g4, still really tricky. So if pawn takes pawn, the pawn marches on, and this is winning for white. Let me just go to the end of this variation. This is fun. Okay, random checks. Well, the king will just walk towards the rook. So, okay, let's play this. I've constructed a little mating net here, and pawn takes pawn. Thank you very much. Checkmate. So knight g4. Well, again, this is a kind of black to play and draw type problem. Have a look at it. Could you find how to draw this? I tell you what, Carlsen was incredibly cool in this position. He sat there and crunched it out, and after 17 minutes he found bishop a3. Again, this is not an obvious move, and it's a brilliant piece of calculation from the world champion. How counterintuitive to block your one source of counterplay, this a-pawn. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. So, well, if the pawn takes, then actually this is okay for black. So let's just go back. After bishop a3, knight takes, and now the bishop comes back to e7. This is amazing. Threatening the rook, but also ready to sacrifice the pawn on sacrifice the bishop on g5. And there's still a chance to punt the a pawn as well. So here we go, rook d7, bishop takes pawn. So again, if that's taken, the rook switches over and then you can take the knight. Knight takes now, not bishop takes pawn, because there's a juicy discovered check. Taking the rook. So Carlsen gave a check. And now it looks desperate, but in fact you can play bishop takes pawn and get rid of another of white's pawns. If that's taken, then there's rook check and the knight drops here. So knight e5 check. It's still not over. This is still very tricky. And now, of course, it's impossible to take that pawn because of rook mate. With the king at the side of the board, still tricky. So now it's time to deflect the rook. That's absolutely vital. Well, let's just see rook a7. In fact, after this, it's not possible to hang on to that pawn. We can always check the king away, basically. And this is okay for black. So coming back to this position, rook d5, again a tricky move. If king takes pawn, knight check. It's all in the detail. So after rook d5, whoops, sorry, that was unintended. After rook d5, rook b4 check. Let's check the king away. We deflect the rook with the a pawn. Okay, we make a queen, and then finally, having deflected the rook, black can take the pawn and reach the endgame rook and knight against rook, which actually is relatively easy to draw. And Sarana, well, played a couple of symbolic moves, and in this position he agreed to draw. It's really not very difficult to defend this one, and I think it was about time to offer a draw. So I think Carlsen did absolutely brilliantly to hold that game, but great credit to Alexei Sarana, who really tested the world champion. Thanks very much for watching. More reports coming from the Isle of Man very soon.